Put down the remote, set your phasers to stun, and pick up that paperback.
You do have books in the 24th century.
Welcome to episode 6 of Reading Trek, a Star Trek book club podcast, proud member of the Tricorder Transmissions Network. My name is Marty Ali, and I'm joined by my co-host, William Conlon. Will, how you doing today?
I am great, Marty. We're recording right after the Oscars, and I couldn't be happier with the way things went. A lot of Star Trek people up on stage today, Doug Jones, and there was even a reference to Star Trek in the history of cinema, so I couldn't be in a better place.
Wonderful, wonderful. I did not get to watch the Oscars, but caught up enough on Twitter. All right, for those of you who are new to the podcast, we are a Star Trek book club podcast working through the expanded universe one novel at a time. Although we do encourage you to follow along with the reading, this podcast was designed as a way to give all fans a way to journey through the expanded universe together, even if you haven't read the books. If you're reading along with us, revisiting an old favorite, or if you just want to know more about the expanded universe, this is a podcast for all Trek fans. Today we've broken the show up into 4 main segments because we are covering a trilogy. The first is Turn the Page, where we summarize the reading and give our first reactions. Next is Highlight the Text, where we dig a little deeper and talk about the characters, plot, writing, and how it all connects to the larger Trek universe. And because this is, again, part of a trilogy, we're going to have Read Ahead, where we'll give our theories on the rest of the story. And lastly, we'll have Shelve It, where we wrap up the novel and give our final thoughts and ratings.
Before we dive into the novel, we want to take a moment to talk about our voicemail contest. Reading Trek is holding a contest, and you can enter to win a brand new hardbound copy of the Autobiography of Jean-Luc Picard by David A. Goodman. To enter, all you have to do is call our voicemail at 609-512-5527 and leave us an up to 2-minute message with your thoughts on the show or something we've been reading.
I'm so excited about this voicemail contest because we are so excited to hear from you. We really want to hear what you think of the show, what you think of the reading, all that good stuff. And don't worry, it's a Google Voice number, so nobody else is going to pick up the phone. You're not going to disturb anybody. Fully automated. So just feel free to call the number, 609-512-5527. Again, that's 609-512-LLAP. All right, with that said, let's get to today's selection.
That's the book. I know it's a book. The book.
Today, we will be discussing chapters 18 through 37 of Star Trek Prometheus, Fire with Fire, by Bernd Perples and Christian Homburg.
All right, let's remind everyone when and where in the Trek universe is this taking place.
The question isn't where we are. It's when we are.
Fire with Fire takes place post-Nemesis in the year 2385. It is set just after the events of the novel series The Fall.
So Marty, any trivia for us today?
No, not today.
Aw, I like trivia.
Womp womp. I do too, but I used it all last week.
So please call in and tell us your trivia about this book. You may teach us something we don't even know about this.
I would love that. I would love that.
I wasn't aware you indulged in the literature of fantasy.
Light reading is considered relaxing, Captain.
All right, well, with that, I'll turn it over to you for the recap. But first, we'd like to remind you that from here on out, there will be spoilers for Star Trek Prometheus.
Blank alert. Blank alert.
Would you be so kind and turn the page for us, Will?
Last time on Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
Lieutenant Jassat Namur is in an empty Starboard 8 lounge when he is joined by Ambassador Spock. Jassat is being singled out by fellow Starfleet officers due to him being from the Reneo race. Spock suggests that Jassat must decide where he calls home. Meanwhile, after investigating the wreckage of the attacked starbase, it is discovered that the attack vessel is Romulan. Spock contacts a retired Tal Shiar agent, Thokal, that he became friends with while working underground on Romulus. Thokal leverages old contacts and discovers a large cache of weapons and ships have gone missing since the Romulan Civil War. Meanwhile, the fleet station at Cestus III on the edge of Gorn space is destroyed in another attack. This time, 9 starships and tens of thousands of lives are lost. The Klingons are building up an armada on the border of Federation space and declare they will attack the Renau if one more Klingon target is hit. Back in the Lambada cluster, the Prometheus and Bordas establish diplomatic relations with the Renau, but are met with a cold response. They proceed to Lambda Prime and are escorted into orbit by several out-of-date ships. Back in Romulan space, a Ferengi posing as a famed arms dealer infiltrates the weapons ring and discovers the group selling to the Renau. During the time when the Imperial Romulan state had taken over following Shinzon, large amounts of weapons were stolen and are now being scattered across the galaxy to the highest bidder. On Lambda Prime, teams of investigators split up seeking answers. Jassat visits an ancient site and is greeted by an old friend. Well invited to see another friend, Jassat discovers they have both joined the Purifying Flame. Jassat reluctantly informs his superiors, and a joint Federation Klingon group is sent to investigate. The Starfleet officers have prejudice towards the Renau and turn a blind eye while the Klingons kidnap and torture Jassat's friends. At a quarry for the same highly explosive elements used in the bombs against the Federation and Klingons, Lanisa, Commander Kirk, and 2 Klingons are ambushed by Purifying Flame members and kidnapped. Shortly after their disappearance is noticed, the Prometheus receives another video from the Purifying Flame that if they do not leave the cluster, the officers will be killed. Captain Adams is informed by Kromms that he knows where the prisoners are without revealing he tortured the Renaus that were captured earlier. Both Starfleet and Klingons mount a rescue mission for their missing crewmates, but the firefight gets hot. Several are wounded and some are killed. As the Purifying Flame attempts to escape, the Bortas begins picking off fighters while the Prometheus beams over crews of transports attempting to find the missing officers. One of the attack ships uses a bomb to partially disable the Bortas. On one of the transports, the kidnapped Starfleet officers and surviving Klingon overtake the crew, but find their engines are set to overload and the ship will soon explode. At the last possible moment, they are beamed aboard the Prometheus, and just as the Purifying Flame's flagship is about to be caught, they activate an unknown form of engine and escape without a trace. Later, in sickbay, as the kidnapped officers recover, Jassat visits his old friends, only to discover Spock is preparing to mind meld with one of them. After a particularly violent mind meld, Spock reveals to Jassat and Captain Adams that the Renau race is subject to mass brainwashing, and the violence they are exhibiting is becoming more and more subconscious. With this new knowledge, the Prometheus and Bortas head deeper into the Lambda cluster to seek answers and resolve the crisis. The end. For now.
Nicely done, Will. Nicely done. So my first reaction is that this book really picked up steam in the last half.
So much.
It was action-packed. It finally took on an identity of its own, and I'm hooked. I can't wait for the next novel in the series.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, again, you picked a really great point to set our 2 episodes, part 1 and part 2, because it almost feels like a different novel. Part 1 feels like it is
really does.
Entirely a prologue. I was knocking it last week for the amount of exposition. This second half really not only picked up, but felt like more Trek.
It definitely did. So moving in to highlight the text, how did it feel more Trek to you?
Well, you had more of that investigation component to it. You had the diplomacy. That first half seemed to really drag for me because we were introducing so many characters and so much backstory, and it just got to be a little too much for me. Now we got into more story, and by the end of it, I'm thinking, oh yeah, I really want to see where this is going. I can't wait for the next book to come out.
Yeah, same here. Did you have any favorite moments?
I had my favorite frustrating moments because every time the several Starfleet officers that had prejudices towards Jassat came into play, I kept hearing Picard's voice saying, "That is not indicative of a Starfleet officer." So I started wondering right off the bat if the kind of lesser-willed people aboard the Prometheus are already starting to be affected by whatever it was that took down the Valiant in our prologue.
Interesting. I didn't make that connection until you said it just now, but that's really... Yeah, we'll have to keep an eye on that in the future.
Because I think if that's what hits them, then it's going to be interesting to see what happens when it hits the Klingons.
Oh, yeah. Well, speaking of the Klingons, Kromms, he's a very angry Klingon.
Mm-hmm.
I think someone needs to get him some bloodline, because he just needs to chill out. I don't like the way that Kromms is kind of just resisting, like, at every turn of the game. And then taking that extra step when he captured the 2 Renau civilians.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think of Captain Kromms?
Well, I think Captain Kromms is certainly going to prove to be dangerous if they do encounter whatever it was that took down the Valiant and is brainwashing this entire culture, because he's not only got so much more to prove, but he has absolutely no filter and ability to control himself. So he's gonna be a danger to a lot.
Definitely. I really grew to love the character of Jassat Namur.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, his storyline became really interesting in this last half of the book, because he's stuck between 2 worlds, the Federation life that he chose, and then his home spheres. He wants to remain loyal to them as well. But no one really wants him. The people on the starship don't want him there, and the people on his home spheres don't want him there. So I really kind of felt for him. We get a really great moment from him later on page 369, and I'll just quote it here. Quote, "I am who I am, sir," he said. Then suddenly, the words just came out of his mouth faster than he could think them. "That's my role. It's the only one I'm capable of playing. It's not defined by circumstance or the opinions of others. I define it myself. I'm Renau and a lieutenant in Starfleet. I am my own home. I am myself."
I had that line highlighted as well, so I'm glad you picked that.
Yeah, he's a great character, and I can't wait to see what else he has to offer when the trilogy gets going.
And I was drawing a lot of parallels to him and Worf, because, of course, Worf is the first Klingon in Starfleet, and he had to deal with that similar, ostracizing from his peers aboard the Enterprise. So I'm glad they're drawing that at the Enterprise and on Deep Space Nine. I think it kind of flows through. That's part of Worf's character for so long.
Yeah.
So I'm really glad they're establishing that with a new character, because that's what Starfleet is all about. You've got new planets coming in all the time, and there's always going to be that first of a species to join Starfleet. It's always interesting to see their journey.
Yeah, I agree. It's really fascinating.
On the other side of that, just kind of reinforcing what I was talking about a minute ago, I have a quote that I highlighted here talking about the prejudices that are being put against him. And I'm on Kindle instead of a paperback, so I don't have a page number, but for those of you reading digitally, this is location 2549. Quote, "Adams had wanted to know whether he was prepared to defend the Federation's values against the Renau, who might be deluded and might look upon him as a traitor. A stranger. Jassat had affirmed that question, but what about Federation citizens who were looking at him as if he was an alien? What about people like this engineer and his accusing gaze? The man by the counter was by no means the only one, as the previous days aboard the Prometheus had proven to Jassat. Wherever he looked, he was met with mistrust. Not necessarily on the bridge, but on the lower decks. Almost everywhere he noticed questioning gazes, frowns, and whispers behind his back. Shipmates fell silent when he came around a corridor corner. Near the engine room, some ensign had even snapped at him, calling him a murderer. Jenna Kirk, who had witnessed the incident by chance, had given the man a proper dressing down so that he took to his heels just as soon as he had been dismissed."
That's a really good passage, yeah.
And that almost scares me to hear that that's happening on a Federation vessel, because that is not Starfleet, and no Starfleet I've ever known.
I really hope this is just whatever is affecting, whatever affected the Valiants is now just affecting this crew, because that would be the only way that kind of behavior is excusable.
Mm-hmm. And the only other time that I can recall that happening that we know of is the way that Phlox was treated after the Xindi attack in Enterprise, which I thought was a horrendous moment as well. I always reel at that episode because I love Phlox. Phlox is fantastic, and you have this horrible xenophobia against him.
Yeah, yeah. So in the recap, you mentioned a Ferengi whose name is Glomp, and who I love. I thought he was such a wonderful, comical addition to the book. I'm normally not a fan of Ferengi stories in general. I usually skip those episodes on Deep Space Nine, except for the more, the better ones. But I liked Glomp, and I want more of Glomp.
Yeah, Glump was cool. I think it's great that you not only have a Ferengi secret agent, but that he's also
Yeah.
he's just that same style of Ferengi that he's brave and yet he's scared, and he's a badass.
Yeah, he's really cool. And I love that he's not really on anybody's side. He's just kind of like, well, whatever's good for business. Let's see here. Let's talk about Jenna Kirk for a little bit.
Yeah.
She had a little interesting tidbit about her. She is, well, from what I could read into the text, sounds like she's a gay character. She likes other women. She almost said it outright, but didn't want to because the Klingons would hear her. So she says she might have feelings for Lanisa, and I like the way that was done. If I can pull it up real quick. On page 347, Kirk nodded. Lanisa was courageous, without a doubt. If I hadn't lost my heart already, I might even fall in love with her. Shot through her mind. End quote.
I think that's great. Yeah, that'll be interesting to see if anything develops there in the future books in this trilogy.
I hope so, because that's such an interesting thing to not touch ever again. I just kind of love the way it was done, just very under the radar, just kind of like happenstance. They didn't make a big deal about it. I just hope she doesn't die in the next book.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we discussed last week, too, there's no overt reason that she is a Kirk at this point, so I'm hoping the writers have something kind of larger planned in scale that ties it back to the fact that she's a Kirk, because otherwise it's fan service.
I think the same thing with Ambassador Spock. Like, why is he along for this journey? Unless the Germans just really love Spock, in which case, because it's written for Germans, fan service to them.
Yeah, that's very true. Because also, if they're following the proper Trek universe, like we said last week, we're only about 2 years away from Romulus being destroyed by a supernova and Spock being sucked into a black hole. So it'll be curious to see what place he has in this story, knowing where he's going in just a couple of years.
Yeah. So, we get a lot of new technology in this book. I actually don't know if one of them has been mentioned in novels before, so if they have, our apologies. We are, going through this with fresh eyes. So, on page 331, there's a mention of personal deflector shield belts, which, as you know from my most recent animated series watch, reminded me of their personal shield belts.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting, and that the personal shields are able to withstand falling rock on them, but can't take bullets.
Yeah.
I thought it was also interesting that the Renault have, traditional guns with bullets as well.
Outdated technology. That's one of the whole points of the first half of the book was how are they doing this when they don't have up-to-date technology? They don't have things that could slip by the sensors. They don't have technology that can go transwarp like it did, or slipstream, or however they were traveling. We did find out at the end of the book how they were traveling, which I also thought was really, really cool. So the ship has this blinding flash and then it's gone. And then Ambassador Spock kind of figured it out. Quote, it's on page 359. Fascinating, Spock commented. The Vulcan turned away from the tactical consoles, raising an eyebrow. It would seem that we have just witnessed an unknown variety of faster-than-light travel. What do you mean? Did the ship jump into warp? No, Captain. Apparently the Renault are capable of folding space-time in order to facilitate a jump across an unknown span.
Yeah.
So not only are we introduced to slipstream drives, quantum slipstream drives, but now we have a folding space distortion drive to deal with. And I think technology is getting a little out of hand in the 24th century.
Seriously, this is like a Christopher Nolan film.
I know.
That's an Interstellar joke for those of you out there.
I love Interstellar. It's such a good movie. A little long, but it's good.
A little long. Yeah, I thought it was really interesting. The quote that I had written down was, had the Renault developed that technology themselves, and if so, when and how, or was there yet an unknown entity in this game? I like the way that was written out.
Yeah. There definitely is an unknown entity in this game that we haven't figured out yet.
And speaking of generally new technology, I know it's not new because we saw it on screen in Voyager, but we had a use of multi-vector assault mode, which I thought was really cool because that's Prometheus's big thing, if you will.
It wasn't as grandiose as I thought it was going to be.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard to write. What do they call it in the other podcast? Starship porn.
Yeah.
It's not as easy to write that as it is to just watch it. So I think that's...
I don't know. I think we got a little bit of it in when we were first introduced to the ship in this book. I think that was like, that put a visual in my mind that was like starship porn. But like when this kind of broke apart, like I wasn't getting that. Like, I mean, just a paragraph would have been fine. Just something about like, oh, you know how the ship unlocked and it was gleaming and the three pieces,
Yeah. I mean,
you get a visual in your head.
The way that they portrayed the Enterprise D separating the saucer in Encounter at Farpoint, that was like, knock your socks off just from the start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you have anything else for highlight the text, Will?
Yeah, I have one more standout moment that I'd like to read here, which I really loved. This was in chapter 36. For Kindle readers, it was location 4625. Quote, "The turbolift door opened and Ambassador Spock entered the bridge. Captain, if I can be of any assistance, I have significant experience with precarious situations." Adams sized him up. On the one hand, he was grateful that the famous Starfleet officer offered his services. On the other hand, he had reservations. The half-Vulcan had been a civilian for the better part of a century now. Spock raised an eyebrow. "If you are concerned that I am not capable of handling the Prometheus's systems, I can dispel your concerns. I have had ample opportunities during the past days to familiarize myself with the ship's control." A crooked smile played across Adams' lips. Of course he had. He was Spock, and Spock didn't do things by halves. So
Yeah, that's great.
So that's basically Spock saying, it's just like riding a bike.
Yep.
I loved the idea of, the Leonard that we had in the 2009 Trek, on the bridge of the Prometheus, doing this.
This super advanced ship in the fleet, yeah. Just kind of... And I imagine him in that robe he wears in Star Trek 4, just kind of like walking around all the time, like sashaying through the corridors of the Prometheus.
My favorite line in Star Trek 4 is when she says, "Are you sure you won't change your mind?" And he says, "Is there something wrong with the one I have?"
He's great in that film. He's so funny.
That people you'll know that's like my go-to Trek film. That's been my favorite Trek film since I was 6 years old. So I love that.
All right, Will. Do you have any Trek connections this week?
You think it's all connected somehow?
Well, yes, I do. We had a few more, and they're not nearly as many as the first half of the book, which was so heavy with Trek connections. I was vomiting canon references by the time I was done with it. But we had a great reference in the Romulan section to Balance of Terror, which is one of my top TOS episodes. They were talking about, the incursion of the Romulan ship into Federation space and the Enterprise encounter. We had... Sorry, I'm looking through my notes here. We had a reference to Voyager with Message in a Bottle because, and Marty and I were joking about this before we started recording, Andy Dick is in this book. The hologram, the emergency medical hologram Mark II makes an appearance at the end. He's not fully the Mark II, but they like him so much because of his history with Prometheus that they just kept upgrading the software without changing his personality. So they described Andy Dick's character in Voyager as being their EMH, and they call him Trike because his version of the hologram has a tricorder built into it.
That's funny.
Yeah, we have one other canon thing that I'd like to mention. We get a brief mention of the SCE, the Starfleet Corps of Engineers, which is a reference to another book series, which we'll be covering later in this podcast. somewhere down the line. We actually talked with Dayton Ward about that because he was one of the co-creators of the SCE. They are the group that is tasked with repairing all the damage done by the big Federation ships as they come in. So I like that they're
crew.
Yeah, I like that they're referencing both canon and expanded universe in this. How about you, Marty?
I love that they included that in there. I mean, I got the, the basic stuff that anyone would pick out. The Nemesis connection on page 222. And then we also got another reference to transparent aluminum on 283.
Yay, excuse me while I go take my shot.
I think we need a new sound effect for every time we see transparent aluminum in the text.
I think we just need the guy from Voyage Home who says, transparent aluminum?
Yeah, throw that in there. I love it.
Transparent aluminum?
It'll be a thing from now on, people. I apologize in advance.
Yeah, other than that, I didn't find anything. It wasn't as nearly as much as it was last episode. How about favorite quotes? Which, by the way, we did skip last week.
Okay, I have a favorite quote that I highlighted. It was in chapter 18, so right on the beginning of this part. And the quote was, "It is simple, one might even say simplistic, to look at the atrocities of individuals and extend suspicion to an entire nation. But there is only one standard we can truly apply, our personal standard." And I think that quote speaks to the world that we live in today so much when you have so many horrific things being, perpetrated by single individuals and then thrown on entire cultures and nations and races. We want to save the politics for our good friends over at Polytrex, but in the time that we live in, I have to assume that is a direct reference to the perpetrators of hate, who I think have kind of taken over part of our national narrative.
Well, and that's interesting because it's, written by Germans, so that the fact that they're picking up on, it might have been written well before, recent political activity, which again, we'll leave to Polytrex, but I was actually going to bring this up in later on for Shelve It as one of the quote that stood out to me and help me understand the message of the novel. But yeah, that's a really powerful line there.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually had to stop and I had to just look at that for a minute. I kind of just thought about that because that's a very relevant moment.
It is.
How about you, Marty? What's a quote that you wanted to highlight?
I actually have 3. One of them from chapter 18, 185, shortly before your quote. "Violence doesn't solve any problems, Captain. Knowledge does," which I just thought was a great, after-school special kind of message. I also had one on 193, quote, "Emotional species have a tendency to project the deeds and opinions of one person onto an entire people's." He fell silent for a while, dwelling on his thoughts. "These are uncertain times, Lieutenant. Times that will leave scars on all of us. Wherever fear reigns, ideals end up being sacrificed. That was the case a century ago, and I would surmise that it will be the same today."
Nice.
Just kind of piggybacks off what you were saying with the whole, fear of the unknown and all that stuff.
Yeah.
I do have one more.
Mm-hmm.
It's near the end of the book on page 366. Quote, "Don't underestimate hope, Doctor," he said quietly. "Without it, you and I wouldn't have departed for the stars."
Nice. That's a great one. That's one of the things that I've always loved about Star Trek, because it is the final frontier, and you look at people in our history who sought adventure in the unknown. They were the people who crossed the oceans and then crossed the plains in America and the Australian outback, always seeking the things that aren't expressly known, beyond that mountain, what's there. And there isn't a lot left of that, here on Earth. We've explored this planet, so this is what I love about Star Trek, because it inspires us to go out there and find what's next beyond our small sphere.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great message.
So I had one other quote that I like because it's kind of a very subtle reference, and I like that it kind of ties Captain Adams, who I think is a really great captain, where we still are kind of learning about him, but I'm curious to see, where he goes. So there's a quote here where Spock is talking to Adams in Chapter 30, and the quote is, "What?" Adams asked briskly. The corners of Spock's mouth twitched. "You reminded me of someone whom I used to know a long time ago. He also cared little for diplomatic ways when he didn't deem them expedient. And what became of him?" Sighing, Adams clenched his fists. He hated feeling helpless like this, standing by idly while the mills of diplomacy and protocol ground slowly. He would reach his goals every time, Spock said. We all know who Spock's talking about there.
We all do. We're going to be talking about him next week.
Yes, indeed. Can't wait to read his autobiography.
No, that's a great line. I too picked that one out, but I didn't want to dwell on the past, I guess.
So you left it for me.
I left it for you. I knew you would pick it out.
We're in mind meld.
We are. All right, anything else you have for Highlight the Text this week, Will?
Well, I have one more thing I just want to talk on a kind of a stylistic note as far as the writers go. I don't want to knock the writers too much because I know this is the first German Trek novel, and there's a lot of English Trek.
And it was a translation, so some things might have been lost.
Yeah, but I think one of the things that got to me was the fact that we had 37 chapters, and if my count was correct, 6 chapters ended with basically the same line, where you have a character and something happens to them, and then everything goes dark. It's like a representation of them either being killed or knocked out, and I think it's easy to get yourself into a loop when it comes to your writing styles. So in 37 chapters, 6 of them, that's a sizable percentage of the book,
Yeah.
they ended with a character going dark. There's easier ways to not write yourself the same line each time. So I would just, maybe that's part of the translation. Maybe that's the way that this book was re-edited for English.
Maybe they just don't have a lot of ways to say that in German, and that's why it was like that. And then when it was translated, that's, what it was every time
Very
for
true.
us in English. So I don't think we should discredit them too much for that, because that just might be the differences between English and German.
Yeah, very, very true. Just on chapter 33, there's a point where everything goes dark, and then on chapter 5, there's a point where everything goes dark.
But
and the prologue,
also,
everything goes dark.
To defend what you're saying, this book should have gone through an English editor, and he should have noticed that and contacted the writers and say, "Hey, can we change this up a little bit?"
Exactly.
It gets a little monotonous,
Yeah. I think also something that I just was interested in, because again, we're very fresh to the Trek expanded novel universe, but is the idea that Federation Standard is what people know as English. Is that a thing? Do you know, Marty?
I don't know. But I'm assuming that Federation Standard's just the language that everybody chose to speak, which is probably English, since the Federation's based, their headquarters are on Earth. In San Francisco.
I thought that was really fascinating because that's also something that ties back to the fact that this is a German novel. So, it's weird for the Germans to assume that English would be the dominant language of the Federation. So I think that was a smart thing for them to put in there rather than saying English. I liked that a lot.
Yeah.
And there's a famous meme out there that I love that always makes me laugh. That's people commenting that if the universal translator is always working, does that mean Picard is speaking French on the bridge of the Enterprise and everyone else just hears it as English?
Oh yeah, or does Worf speak Klingon all the time?
Precisely.
And we could get into a whole topic on the universal translators and why sometimes you hear Worf in Klingon and sometimes it's English, but that's a topic for another podcast, I think.
Oh God, I want to be involved in that one.
I would love to just talk all day about the discrepancies in technology that they use in the 24th century. I could talk for hours about it.
Yes, indeed. But I think that might have to be a Tricorder transmissions roundtable.
It's a good idea. I'm all for it.
Excellent. Well, why don't we move on to read ahead and talk about our predictions and theories for the next novel in this trilogy. Marty, what are your thoughts for the upcoming novel, which is titled The Root of All Rage?
Well, I think that Kromms is going to cause lots of drama. I think he will be a great foil for Captain Adams up on the ship, because Adams doesn't seem like he's going to be going on very many away missions. So I think he'll have his hands full with Kromms. I think Jassat is going to be the glue that holds this whole situation together. I really think he's going to have to make the people... He's going to have to be the one to make everyone realize that they're under a spell. None of this is really happening. You know, it's not who you are. It's not who the Federation is. It's not who the Renown are. You know, because it's going to come to like some kind of explosion, I'm assuming, by book 3. So that's my prediction, that Jassat's going to save the day. And I still don't know what they're going to do with Mr. Spock. I tried to guess what Spock's purpose is, and I come up with nothing. So
I agree 100% with you. It seems almost weird to have him in there, broaching on fan service. We'll see whether there's a specific reason why he couldn't have been any other ambassador with any connection to the Romulans. So it'll be curious to see what his reason for being there. And I think the same thing with Kirk. To have a Kirk there better be a good reason why she is a Kirk.
Yeah, I agree. But other than that, like, I'm really looking forward to The Root of All Rage, the next one. I believe it comes out in May, so we will be covering that in June. So I'm looking forward to that a lot.
That's great. And for those of you who are enjoying this podcast and listening along with us, we actually still have our guest slot for that episode open at this time. So if you are planning on reading that book and would like to be involved in Reading Trek, hit us up on Twitter and maybe we'll select you to come on with us.
Yeah, that'd be great. How about you? What do you think is going to happen?
I agree with you 100%. I think Jassat is going to be our savior in this series. I think that's really great too, because that is going to allow him to be the ostracized loner of his race who then ends up saving his race. And I think that's going to teach the Renown a lot about, respecting outworlders, as they called them. And it might even pave a way for them to rejoin the Federation and not be so isolationists. So I think that's a great point. I think the crew of Prometheus is going to get more and more into this hate mongering control that is taking over the Renown, and I think it's going to take over the Klingons, so I think we're on our way for that. It'll be interesting to see how Captain Adams manages to overcome that versus the captain of the Valiant in the prologue. And of course, I assume we're going to get more on that. We're going to go to that planet, which I assume has the wreckage of a Constitution-class ship somewhere on it.
Oh, that'd be really cool if they broke in, and just like they were doing a little tour of a Constitution-class ship. All right. So, now we're going to move into Shelvets. We're going to put this book back on the shelf. To do that, we have to talk about the morals, messages. What did it all mean?
Yeah, well, I think it kind of was summed up in all the quotes we were doing about, xenophobia and hatred. I think this is definitely a Trek novel for today's world, 2018. Not getting into politics, save that for Shashank and Barry, but I think there is a strong message in this book that's hard to deny.
Yeah, it was very much a novel about xenophobia and tolerance. And I love that quote that you pulled out earlier. That was something I was going to read now, but it rings. It's very powerful, very short quote, but very powerful quote. You have to, define yourself by your own standards. You can't be tied to a standard from your past and a standard from your future. Like you have to merge the two. You have to keep who you are while still kind of rolling with the punches and adapting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that touches also at the end when Spock asks Jassat if the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Will, how would you rate the book?
I would give this book, honestly, I don't want to knock it because I did enjoy the second half of it. I'm going to say 7. I'm going to say warp 7. Um, that first half was just so canon heavy and so fan servicey, but it really picked up afterwards. I mean, if it had followed through like that, then it would be much lower rating, but I enjoyed it. So warp 7.
I gave this one 4 out of 5 deltas. I was going to give it a 3.5 out of 5, but I think with the message in the book being so strong and the action and drama at the last half of the book so strong as well, that it kind of made up for all the exposition heavy stuff we got in the beginning of the novel. So that's why I bumped it up to 4.
Nice.
Still not quite a 5 because of all the exposition in the beginning, but it's a very entertaining book. Again, I can't wait for book 2 in the series.
Excellent. Well, why don't we move on to our fan reactions? I don't think we have anything specifically discussing this book, but there's been some activity on our Twitter account throughout the week. So, Marty, why don't you talk about that a little bit?
From Twitter user @Matt_AL81, Matthew Parsons writes, was about to tweet, why do you have the trilogy when the English translations of books 2 and 3 aren't out yet? Then took a closer look and didn't. I have book 1 and we'll be getting to it soon. Oh, thanks, Matthew. We're glad you're listening.
All right, well, that's great, Marty. And remember, Twitter is a great way to get a hold of us, and we're going to tell you in just a minute how you can do that and how we can continue the discussion.
Hey, Will, what are we going to be talking about next week?
Next time on Reading Trek, we will be discussing chapters 1 through 6 of The Autobiography of James T. Kirk by David Goodman. Marty, tell us a little more about this novel.
Wow, is that a book?
The Autobiography of James T. Kirk chronicles the greatest Starfleet captain's life in his own words. From his birth on the USS Kelvin, his youth spent on Tarsus 4, and his time in the Starfleet Academy, his meteoric rise through the ranks of Starfleet, and his illustrious career at the helm of the Enterprise. This in-world memoir uncovers Captain Kirk in a way Star Trek fans have never seen. Kirk's singular voice rings throughout the text, giving insights into his convictions, his bravery, and his commitment to the life in all forms throughout this galaxy and beyond. Excerpts from his personal correspondence, captain's log, and more give Kirk's personal narrative further depth.
Oh, that's so exciting. I cannot wait for this. And who's going to be joining us for these 2 episodes?
Our good friend Tyler Habiger.
All right, that's great. I'm so excited that Tyler's
And he's
going to be
such a big
joining
Kirk
us.
fan, so I'm excited to hear him talk about this.
He is like the Kirk cosplayer at STLV. I mean, if you haven't seen him before, he rocks the green wrap. He's got a great Generations Kirk cosplay, so that's really exciting to have him on. And I think he's going to be joining us down the line for the autobiography of Jean-Luc Picard as well.
Yep.
Cool. Well, as always, our upcoming selections can be found on our website, which is readingtrek.thetricordertransmissions.com, and on our Twitter @ReadingTrek.
Before we finish today's podcast, let's let everyone know how they can get a hold of us to continue the conversation. You can find me on Twitter @TimeTravelMarty. You can also reach me in the unofficial Star Trek Las Vegas convention group on Facebook. Will, how can everybody get a hold of you?
You can find me on Twitter as well. I am @WilliamG. and I am also in the unofficial Star Trek Las Vegas Facebook group. That is a tremendous community of Star Trek fans. You don't have to be a convention attendee to be a part of it. Obviously, we will try to suck you into our orbit if you do, but it's a great place to just talk with over 4,000 Star Trek fans, and that is moderated by our Tricorder Transmissions heads, Heather and Jeff, and also Jesse Okendo, who is is a great friend of the podcast network. So yeah, hit us up on there and let's continue this discussion. But if you'd like to get a hold of the show with your comments, questions, and feedback, you can find us on Twitter at ReadingTrek and by email at readingtrekpodcast@gmail.com. If you would like to enter the voicemail contest, or if you just want to leave us a message about our show, you can leave a 2-minute message with your thoughts. Please call 609-512-5527. That's 609-512-LLAP. Again, please keep your message to 2 minutes or less, but we really want to hear what you have to say.
Please support this vibrant fan-based podcast network by visiting patreon.com/the Tricorder Transmissions. For as little as $1 a month, patrons can get exclusive early access to some of our unedited shows, interviews, and even get to join in on exclusive Patreon-only chats. We have lots more Patreon content on the way that you won't want to miss, so be sure to visit patreon.com/the Tricorder Transmissions. Also, be sure to mention that ReadingTrek sent you so that we can get you a special shout-out on our next show. And with that, Captain Picard wants us to let him read in peace.
I will leave you now to your book.
That is all I ask.